Spiritual Pennies from Heaven, Awakening to Overflow, Signs, and Sacred Abundance, by David Rousseau. What if abundance has never stopped arriving, only our ability to notice it has? Even when something as small as the penny was removed from circulation, the message behind it was never meant to disappear. Life still speaks in symbols, provision still shows up in unexpected ways, and abundance still overflows quietly, consistently, and spiritually into the lives of those willing to see it. This is not about currency, it is about consciousness. Introduction. There are moments in life when meaning arrives quietly, not through dramatic events or loud announcements, but through something far smaller: an unexpected pause, a timely encounter, a thought that seems to appear exactly when it is needed most. For some, it is a passing conversation. For others, it is a coincidence that feels too aligned to ignore. And for many, it has been a simple phrase carried through generations. Pennies from heaven. At its surface, it sounds almost whimsical, a small thing, a sentimental idea. But beneath it lies something deeper: a way of noticing life that does not depend on scale to recognize significance. Traditionally, pennies from heaven has been used to describe unexpected blessings, not necessarily large transformations, but small forms of support that arrive without warning. A solution when there was none, a moment of relief during pressure, or quiet reassurance when uncertainty felt overwhelming. In this way, the penny becomes more than currency. It becomes a symbol of presence, of timing, of life meeting us where we are. And yet, in a modern world where physical pennies are becoming less common, something interesting happens. The symbol begins to shift. It no longer depends on metal or monetary value to carry meaning. Instead, it invites a different kind of awareness, one that asks not what is given, but what is being noticed, because abundance has never been only about quantity. It has always been about perception. There are seasons in life where everything feels measured: income, time, energy, opportunity. In those seasons, it becomes easy to believe that life is structured only around what can be counted. But there is another layer operating underneath that measurement, a quieter layer, one that does not announce itself loudly, but reveals itself through patterns, timing, and subtle alignment. This audiobook is not about replacing financial reality with fantasy. It is about expanding awareness beyond limitation. It is about recognizing that even within structured systems of exchange, there are moments that feel guided, moments that feel unplanned yet strangely precise. We often miss these moments because we are trained to look for the large and obvious. We expect abundance to arrive in major events, significant gains, or visible breakthroughs. But much of life does not move that way. It moves through increments, through details, through what can be easily dismissed if we are not paying attention. A spiritual penny, in this sense, is not about wealth in the literal sense. It is about recognition. It is about noticing that something small carried meaning, that something ordinary arrived at an extraordinary time. That support, in whatever form it takes, often shows up more quietly than we expect. And when that recognition begins to grow, something shifts internally. Scarcity thinking starts to loosen. The idea that life is withholding begins to soften. In its place, a different interpretation starts to form, one where life is not absent of support, but filled with it in subtle, distributed ways. This is the invitation of this journey, not to chase abundance as something far away, but to become aware of how often it is already present. Not to inflate meaning where none exists, but to become sensitive to meaning that has been overlooked. Because when awareness changes, experience follows, and sometimes, what once seemed like just a passing moment begins to feel like something else entirely: a reminder, a message, a quiet form of provision. A penny is small, but what it represents, when seen differently, can be far greater than its size suggests. Chapter 1. The Language of Small Signs. Life rarely speaks in only one language. There is the language of words, spoken and written, where meaning is direct and structured. There is the language of events, where outcomes become visible and undeniable. But there is another language far quieter, more subtle, and often overlooked. It is the language of small signs. This language does not announce itself. It does not demand attention. Instead, it appears in fragments, a repeated number on a clock, a song that plays at just the right moment, a conversation that echoes a question you are already holding inside. On their own, these moments can seem insignificant, but together, they begin to form a pattern that feels less like coincidence and more like communication. To understand this language is not to abandon logic or reason, it is to expand awareness. It is to recognize that meaning is not always delivered in large, dramatic gestures. More often, it is embedded in the ordinary. A small sign can be as simple as a shift in timing. You think of someone you have not spoken to in years, and within hours, they reach out. You consider a decision you have been avoiding, and suddenly an unrelated conversation brings clarity. You feel uncertain, and then something almost imperceptible gives you a sense of direction. These moments do not prove anything in a scientific sense, but they can profoundly shape how a person feels within their own life. And feeling, in this context, matters, because the language of small signs is not only about external events, it is also about internal recognition. It is the quiet awareness that something is aligning, even if you cannot yet explain how or why. It is the sense that life is not random noise, but a pattern unfolding just beyond immediate comprehension. When people speak of pennies from heaven, they are often pointing to this exact experience, not literal currency falling from the sky, but moments of unexpected support that feel precisely timed, a relief that arrives just before overwhelm becomes too heavy, a solution that appears just as frustration peaks, a reminder that arrives just as doubt begins to settle in. These are not necessarily miracles in the dramatic sense. They are subtler than that. They are adjustments in the rhythm of experience that suggest responsiveness rather than indifference. However, the mind does something interesting with these moments. It often tries to categorize them quickly. It labels them as luck, coincidence, or imagination. And while those explanations are not entirely wrong, they can sometimes limit the depth of what is actually being experienced. Because when everything is reduced to randomness, the subtle language of life becomes harder to hear. This is why awareness is essential, not heightened expectation that every moment must carry hidden meaning, but a willingness to stay open to the possibility that meaning may occasionally be layered beneath the surface. Small signs do not require belief. They require attention. They are not asking to be worshipped or depended upon. They are simply asking to be noticed. And when they are noticed consistently over time, something begins to shift. Life starts to feel less like a series of disconnected events and more like a connected flow. The sense of isolation begins to soften. Even challenges, while still difficult, begin to feel less random and more situated within a larger unfolding. In this way, small signs act almost like punctuation in the sentence of experience. They do not change the message entirely, but they change how it is read. And perhaps that is their purpose, not to overwhelm us with certainty, but to gently remind us that awareness itself is part of the experience, that meaning is not only something we find, but something we participate in through the way we pay attention. The language of small signs is always present. The question is not whether it exists, but whether we are willing to slow down enough to notice it. Because sometimes, what seems like the smallest detail is actually the beginning of a much larger understanding. Chapter 2. What pennies from heaven really means. The phrase pennies from heaven has traveled quietly through time, often spoken in passing, sometimes half joking, and other times with a kind of sincere wonder. But like many phrases that survive across generations, its meaning is not fixed. It evolves with the person who hears it, and beneath its simplicity lies something more profound than a story about money or luck. At its core, pennies from heaven is not about currency at all. It is about perception. It is about those moments when life seems to respond in ways that feel unexpectedly supportive, especially when support was not expected. A problem resolves itself in a way you did not plan. The delay turns out to protect you from something unseen. A conversation arrives at the exact emotional point where you needed clarity. These experiences are often small in appearance, but their timing gives them weight. The penny, in this sense, becomes a symbol of something far greater than its physical value. It represents the smallest recognizable unit of grace, something subtle enough to be missed, yet meaningful enough to shift perspective when noticed. And heaven, in this framework, does not refer only to distant place. It can be understood as the unseen order of life itself, the intelligence, rhythm, or coherence that appears when events are viewed not in isolation, but as part of a larger unfolding. When the two are combined, the phrase becomes less about superstition and more about awareness. It suggests that life is not entirely closed off, not entirely mechanical, and not entirely indifferent. Instead, it hints at responsiveness, subtle, indirect, and often disguised in ordinary circumstances. But here is where interpretation becomes important. If Pennies from Heaven is misunderstood, it can become a form of waiting for signs, waiting for rescue, waiting for something external to validate hope. That is not the intention of the idea. Its deeper meaning is not dependency, but recognition. It is not about expecting life to drop answers into our hands. It is about becoming aware of how often answers were already present, but overlooked. There is a difference between searching for meaning everywhere and learning to notice meaning where it naturally appears. One creates pressure, the other creates clarity. A spiritual understanding of this phrase does not deny struggle. It does not pretend that life is always easy or that challenges are illusions. Instead, it introduces a broader context in which those challenges exist alongside moments of unexpected support. It acknowledges that even within difficulty, there are subtle forms of assistance that do not always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes support looks like timing. Sometimes it looks like interruption. Sometimes it looks like something not happening the way it was planned. And sometimes it looks like a small, almost dismissible moment that only reveals its importance in hindsight. This is why awareness matters more than interpretation, because the mind will always try to categorize experience. It will label events as good or bad, fortunate or unfortunate, meaningful or meaningless. But awareness simply observes first. It allows space before conclusion, and in that space, a different kind of understanding becomes possible. Pennies from Heaven invites that space. It suggests that life may be more layered than it appears at first glance, that beneath the visible structure of effort and outcome, there may be a quieter current of alignment, one that does not override free will, but gently interacts with it. To live with this awareness is not to live in fantasy. It is to live with attention. It is to notice that not everything valuable arrives in large forms. Some of the most stabilizing moments in life come disguised as something small enough to overlook, a moment of relief, a brief sense of clarity, a subtle shift in mood that changes the direction of a day. These are the pennies, not because they are insignificant, but because they are easily missed, and when they are noticed consistently, something begins to change in how life is experienced. The world does not necessarily become easier, but it becomes more readable, less random, more connected. In that way, Pennies from Heaven is not a promise of constant reward. It is an invitation to a different way of seeing, one where meaning is not reserved for the extraordinary, but discovered within the ordinary itself. Chapter 3: The Illusion of Scarcity. Scarcity is not only a condition of resources, it is also a condition of perception. Long before it is experienced in the outer world, scarcity often takes shape internally. It begins as a quiet assumption that there is not enough time, not enough opportunity, not enough support, not enough ease to go around. Over time, this assumption can become so familiar that it starts to feel like reality itself, rather than a lens through which reality is being interpreted. But scarcity, as a lived experience, is often less about what is actually available and more about what is believed to be available. This distinction matters because two people can move through the same circumstances and interpret them in entirely different ways. One may see limitation at every turn. Another may see constraint paired with possibility. The external facts may be identical, yet the internal experience is not. This is where the idea of illusion becomes important, not because lack is never real, but because the mind tends to generalize moments of lack into a permanent worldview. A difficult season can quietly become a permanent identity. Things don't work out for me. Opportunities don't come to me. There is never enough. These thoughts, repeated often enough, begin to filter perception. And once perception is filtered, even neutral events can begin to look like confirmation of limitation. A delay becomes proof of blockage. A rejection becomes proof of unworthiness. a pause becomes proof of absence. Yet the same events can be interpreted differently. When seen through a different internal framework, a delay can be protection, a rejection can be redirection, a pause can be preparation. The external situation has not changed, but the meaning assigned to it has. This is the subtle power of perception. It shapes emotional reality long before physical reality shifts. Scarcity thinking often creates urgency without clarity. It pushes the mind into constant comparison, constant measuring, constant evaluation of what is missing. In that state, it becomes difficult to notice what is already present, not because it is not there, but because attention is trained elsewhere, and what is not noticed, in a lived sense, might as well not exist. The alternative is not forced positivity or denial of difficulty. It is a widening of perspective. It is the willingness to hold more than one possibility at the same time. That something may be lacking in one area while still being present in another. That a closed door does not define the entire landscape. That a current limitation is not necessarily a permanent condition. This is where awareness begins to soften the illusion, because when attention is no longer completely absorbed by what is missing, it becomes possible to notice what is still working, still arriving, still supporting in quieter ways. And often, those quieter forms of support were present even during the moments when scarcity felt absolute. They were simply overshadowed. Pennies from heaven, in this sense, become evidence of that oversight being corrected. Small reminders that life is not only structured around absence, but also around subtle provision, not always dramatic, not always immediate, but present enough to challenge the belief that nothing is available. The illusion of scarcity dissolves slowly, not through argument, but through observation, through noticing, through small corrections in attention. And over time, what begins to shift is not only what is seen, but how life itself is interpreted while it is being lived. Chapter 4: Spiritual Awareness and Everyday Miracles. Spiritual awareness is not reserved for rare moments or extraordinary circumstances. It does not require a retreat from daily life, nor does it depend on dramatic experiences that interrupt the ordinary flow of things. Instead, it begins in the very place most people overlook: the rhythm of everyday living. A common misunderstanding is that miracles must be large to be real, but in lived experience, some of the most meaningful shifts are subtle. A moment of unexpected clarity during confusion, a sense of calm that arrives without explanation, a timing that works out in a way that could not have been carefully planned, yet still unfolds smoothly. These are not always recognized as miracles, because they do not announce themselves with intensity. They arrive quietly, almost casually, and are often absorbed into routine without reflection. Spiritual awareness is the practice of noticing these moments before they are dismissed. It is not about assigning mystical meaning to everything. It is about learning to see what is already present without immediately reducing it to habit or coincidence. The mind tends to categorize quickly. It labels experiences so they can be processed efficiently. But in that efficiency, something is often lost: the depth of the moment itself. When awareness begins to expand, the ordinary starts to shift in tone. The same walk down a familiar street can feel different depending on attention. The same conversation can carry layers that were previously missed. Even silence becomes more noticeable, not as emptiness, but as space. Everyday miracles rarely interrupt life. They exist within it. A delay that prevents a mistake, a chance encounter that redirects a thought process, a moment of hesitation that leads to a better outcome. These are not always recognized in real time. Often, their significance is only visible in hindsight, when the larger pattern begins to reveal itself. But spiritual awareness trains perception to notice earlier, to become sensitive to the subtle changes in experience while they are still unfolding. This sensitivity does not require belief in anything beyond what is observable. It simply requires patience with interpretation, a willingness to pause before labeling an event as meaningless, a willingness to consider that meaning may not always be immediate or obvious, but still present. In this way, awareness becomes less about searching for miracles and more about recognizing them as they occur within ordinary life. There is a quiet intelligence in how moments align, not in a way that removes uncertainty, but in a way that occasionally reveals coherence within it. a sense that life is not entirely fragmented, even when it feels unpredictable. This does not eliminate challenge. Difficult experiences still occur, confusion still arises, but spiritual awareness changes the relationship to those experiences. It introduces the possibility that even within difficulty, there may be movement that is not yet understood, and when that possibility is held gently, without forcing explanation, something softens. The need to control every interpretation begins to ease. Life is no longer required to make sense immediately in order to feel meaningful. This is where everyday miracles are most often found, not in perfection, but in perspective, not in the removal of difficulty, but in the presence of insight within it. A small shift in how something is seen can change the entire emotional tone of an experience. And over time, these shifts accumulate. They do not always change external circumstances, but they change how those circumstances are lived internally. Spiritual awareness, then, is not an escape from reality. It is a deeper engagement with it, a way of being present enough to notice that life is continuously speaking, not always loudly, but consistently. And within that ongoing conversation, even the smallest moments can carry the weight of something far greater than they first appear. Chapter 5. The Power of Gratitude as an Abundance Magnet. Gratitude is often spoken about as a positive habit, something encouraged for emotional well-being or mental health. But in its deeper sense, gratitude is not just an attitude, it is a form of attention that reshapes perception itself. What a person gives attention to repeatedly begins to define their sense of reality. Over time, attention becomes selection, and selection becomes experience. In this way, gratitude is not simply the recognition of what is good, it is the practice of choosing what to notice first. This distinction is subtle, but powerful. A mind trained to scan for lack will always find evidence of absence. A mind trained to recognize presence will begin to notice what was already there, but previously overlooked. The external world may not immediately change, but the internal experience of that world begins to shift. Gratitude does not deny difficulty. It does not require pretending that everything is perfect or complete. Instead, it introduces balance into perception. It allows the mind to hold both what is challenging and what is supportive at the same time, without collapsing into only one interpretation. In moments of stress or uncertainty, attention naturally narrows. It focuses on what is unresolved, what is missing, what feels unstable. This narrowing is not a flaw, it is a survival mechanism. But when it becomes the only way of seeing, it can create the impression that life itself is defined by what is lacking. Gratitude gently interrupts that narrowing. It does not force attention away from difficulty, but it widens the frame. It reminds awareness that even within pressure, there are still functioning systems, still moments of relief, still small stabilizing forces at work, a breath that is still available, a moment of rest that still exists, a detail that is still intact. These may seem minor, but their effect is cumulative, because perception is built from repetition, and what is repeatedly noticed begins to feel central. In this way, gratitude functions less like an emotion and more like a lens adjustment. It does not change what is in front of you, but it changes how it is seen. Over time, this shift in perception can alter how life is interpreted. Situations that once felt entirely closed can begin to reveal openings. Moments that once felt neutral can begin to carry meaning, and experiences that once felt overwhelming can begin to feel more contained within a larger context. This is where gratitude begins to feel like an abundance magnet, not in a literal or mechanical sense, but in the way attention influences interpretation. When a person consistently notices what is present, supported, or functioning, they begin to experience life as more resourced, not because new resources suddenly appear, but because existing ones are finally being seen. There is also a quiet emotional shift that comes with this practice. Gratitude softens the urgency of wanting things to be different immediately. It does not remove desire or growth, but it reduces the sense of desperation that often accompanies unmet expectations. And in that softening, clarity becomes more accessible. It becomes easier to make decisions without panic, easier to observe circumstances without distortion, easier to move forward without the weight of constant comparison to what is missing. Gratitude, in this sense, is not about forcing positivity. It is about restoring proportion. It brings the mind back into alignment with what is actually present, rather than what fear suggests is absent, and in doing so, it quietly rebalances the internal experience of abundance. Because abundance is not only a matter of accumulation, it is also a matter of recognition, and what is recognized consistently begins to feel like the foundation of reality itself. Chapter 6. Synchronicity. When life lines up, there are moments in life that feel as though they are connected by something more than chance. Events unfold in sequence, not in a way that feels random, but in a way that feels arranged quietly, almost invisibly, like pieces of a pattern coming into focus at exactly the right time. This experience is often described as synchronicity. Synchronicity is not always dramatic. It does not need to announce itself with intensity or spectacle. More often, it appears in ordinary circumstances. A question you have been holding is answered in an unexpected conversation. A book falls open to a page that speaks directly to your situation. A delay leads you into an encounter that changes your direction in a subtle but meaningful way. On the surface, these moments can be explained away as coincidence, and in many cases, that explanation is technically sufficient. Life is full of overlapping probabilities, timing overlaps, and chance intersections. But explanation and experience are not always the same thing. Synchronicity is about how an event feels when it happens, not only about how it can be categorized afterward. It is the sensation that separate elements of life are momentarily aligning in a way that carries personal significance, not necessarily because the world is sending a message in a literal sense, but because perception recognizes meaning emerging from timing and context. What makes synchronicity powerful is not that it suspends logic, but that it adds depth to experience. It creates a moment where the mind pauses its usual need to control interpretation and instead observes connection as it unfolds. In everyday life, much of experience is fragmented. Tasks, responsibilities, conversations, and thoughts often feel disconnected from one another. Synchronicity interrupts that fragmentation. It briefly reveals a sense of continuity, as if separate threads are part of a larger weave that is only occasionally visible. This does not mean everything is predetermined or orchestrated in a rigid way. Rather, it suggests that life may contain layers of coherence that are not always immediately apparent from a single viewpoint. When people speak of pennies from heaven, synchronicity is often what they are intuitively describing, the feeling that something small and unexpected arrived at precisely the right moment, not necessarily to solve everything, but to shift perspective, open awareness, or provide a sense of alignment during uncertainty. The mind can struggle with this kind of experience because it resists ambiguity. It prefers either control or randomness, structure or chaos. Synchronicity exists in the space between those categories. It does not require abandoning reason, but it does ask for a willingness to tolerate not fully knowing. And in that willingness, something subtle begins to change. Attention becomes more receptive. Instead of filtering experience only through expectation, it begins to notice patterns of timing and connection that were previously overlooked, not because they were not there before, but because they were not being recognized. Over time, this shift does not necessarily make life more predictable, but it can make it feel more coherent, less like isolated events happening in isolation, and more like moments unfolding within a shared rhythm. Synchronicity does not guarantee outcomes. It does not remove uncertainty, but it does offer a different relationship to uncertainty, one in which meaning is not always absent, even when clarity is incomplete. And sometimes, that is enough, because even a brief moment of alignment can change how the next step is taken, not by controlling the path, but by altering the awareness of how the path is being experienced. In that way, synchronicity is not just something that happens, it is something that is noticed. Chapter 7. Overflow thinking. Most people are taught to think in terms of limits: limited time, limited money, limited energy, limited opportunity. This way of thinking is not inherently wrong. It reflects real constraints that exist in daily life. But when limitation becomes the default lens for interpreting everything, it quietly shapes how a person moves through the world. Overflow thinking begins as a subtle shift in that lens. It does not deny that limits exist. Instead, it questions whether limits are the only truth available in any given moment. It introduces the possibility that life is not only structured around what is barely enough, but also around what is more than enough in unexpected ways. Overflow is not only about material abundance, it is also about perception, capacity, timing, and experience. It is the sense that something can be sufficient without being strained, complete without being depleted, and supported without being constantly measured. In scarcity thinking, attention is often focused on preservation, how to hold on, how to avoid loss, how to stretch what is already limited. In overflow thinking, attention begins to shift toward flow, how things move, how support appears, how situations resolve without constant forcing. This does not mean effort disappears. It does not mean responsibility is removed. It means that effort is no longer accompanied by the constant, background assumption that there will never be enough. One of the quiet effects of overflow thinking is reduced internal pressure. When the mind is no longer convinced that everything depends on constant strain, there is more space for clarity. Decisions become less reactive. Choices become less driven by fear of loss. This shift can be subtle at first. It might appear as a moment of pause before reacting, or a small sense of calm in a situation that would normally trigger urgency. Over time, these moments begin to accumulate into a different internal baseline. Overflow thinking also changes how support is recognized. Instead of seeing help as rare or accidental, awareness begins to notice that assistance often arrives in distributed forms through timing, through people, through information, through unexpected resolution, not always in dramatic ways, but in ways that are often just enough. This just enough is important, because overflow is not about excess for its own sake. It is about sufficiency that does not feel constantly threatened. It is the experience of having room to breathe within the structure of life, even when circumstances are not perfect. In this sense, overflow is not something that must be created from nothing. It is something that is often already present but not fully perceived. When attention is trained primarily on lack, even abundance can go unnoticed. When attention expands, what was previously invisible becomes part of lived experience. Spiritual pennies from heaven, in this framework, can be understood as micro-expressions of overflow, small moments that signal that life is not only operating at the edge of limitation, but also contains quiet forms of excess support, timing, and alignment that are easy to miss if not observed. Overflow thinking does not eliminate challenge. It does not prevent difficulty or remove complexity, but it changes the emotional weight carried through those experiences. Instead of feeling like every situation is balanced on the edge of insufficiency, there is a growing sense that movement is still possible, that resolution is still forming, and that not everything depends on immediate control. This shift is not instantaneous. It is practiced through attention, by noticing where enough already exists, by recognizing where support has already shown up, and by allowing those observations to balance the stronger habit of focusing on what is missing. Over time, the mind begins to loosen its fixation on limitation as the only framework, and in that loosening, life begins to feel less like constant compensation for lack, and more like participation in something that is already in motion. Overflow thinking is not about having everything. It is about no longer interpreting everything as never enough. Chapter 8. Letting go of financial fear narratives. Financial fear is rarely just about money. On the surface, it appears as concern over bills, income, stability, and survival. These are real, practical concerns that deserve attention. But beneath them, there is often a deeper layer at work, a narrative that has been quietly formed over time, about what is possible, what is safe, and what is not. This narrative is shaped through experience, observation, upbringing, and repetition. It is reinforced by moments of stress, by stories heard from others, and by personal memories of uncertainty. Eventually, it becomes internalized not just as a set of thoughts, but as a default expectation that resources are fragile, that stability is temporary, and that security must always be actively defended. When this narrative becomes dominant, it begins to influence more than financial decisions. It affects how a person thinks about time, relationships, opportunity, and even self-worth. It creates a background sense of tension that can exist even when immediate circumstances are stable. Letting go of financial fear narratives does not mean ignoring practical reality. It does not mean denying responsibility or abandoning planning. Instead, it means separating present reality from inherited interpretation. There is a difference between "I have a challenge right now" and "life is always unstable." One is situational, the other is identity level. Financial fear narratives often transform situational difficulty into identity-based expectation, and once something becomes identity-based, it begins to shape perception automatically. Every delay feels like decline, every expense feels like loss, every unknown feels like threat. But when awareness begins to shift, these interpretations can be seen more clearly for what they are: stories layered onto experience, not necessarily the full truth of experience itself. This is where inner freedom begins to form, not through forcing positive thinking, but through recognizing that not every interpretation deserves equal authority. Some thoughts are reflections of present reality, others are echoes of past uncertainty, and not all echoes need to be treated as current conditions. Letting go of financial fear narratives is a gradual process of reclassification. It is learning to distinguish between what is happening now and what the mind predicts will always happen. It is noticing when attention is being pulled into projection rather than grounded in actual circumstance. In many cases, fear narrows perception. It focuses attention on what might go wrong, while filtering out evidence of what is currently stable or already supported. This narrowing can feel protective, but it often comes at the cost of clarity. As awareness expands, something subtle begins to change. There is more space between an event and its interpretation, more room to observe before reacting, more ability to see complexity, instead of immediate collapse into worst-case meaning. This is also where the idea of spiritual pennies from heaven can become relevant in a quiet way, not as denial of difficulty, but as recognition that support often appears in smaller, less dramatic forms than fear expects, a timing that works out, a resource that lasts longer than anticipated, a solution that emerges from an unexpected direction. These moments do not erase challenges, but they can soften the absolute nature of fear narratives. They introduce evidence that reality is not always aligned with worst-case assumptions. Over time, this repeated observation can loosen the grip of financial fear, not by eliminating uncertainty, but by reducing its psychological dominance. What begins to emerge is a more flexible relationship with stability, one that acknowledges responsibility without being defined by anxiety, and one that engages with life's uncertainties without assuming they are always leading toward loss. Letting go, in this sense, is not forgetting. It is no longer allowing fear to be the primary storyteller of experience. And when that shift begins, even slowly, life becomes less about defending against imagined collapse, and more about responding clearly to what is actually present. Chapter 9. Becoming a receiver. Most people are trained to think of life as something that must be pursued, earned, or forced into alignment through constant effort. In that framework, value is associated with striving, and receiving is often treated as something secondary, almost passive, as if it requires less participation than action. But becoming a receiver is not passivity. It is a different kind of participation altogether. It is the practice of being open enough to notice what is already arriving. Receiving begins with attention, noticing what is offered, what is available, what is already moving toward you in subtle ways. This can include opportunities, timing, clarity, support, or even simple moments of relief that appear without being directly engineered. However, many people are not fully available to receive, not because nothing is coming, but because their awareness is constantly directed elsewhere, toward anticipation, toward control, toward the next requirement. In that state, even meaningful offerings can pass unnoticed because the mind is already occupied with what it believes must be created next. To become a receiver is to interrupt that constant forward pressure. It is the willingness to pause internal resistance long enough to recognize that not everything requires extraction or effort. Some things arrive when space is available to notice them. This does not remove responsibility. Life still requires action, decision, and participation. But receiving adds a missing dimension, the recognition that not all value is produced. Some of it is encountered. A simple example can illustrate this shift. A conversation offers clarity that was not anticipated. A delay creates a window that prevents a mistake. A small, unexpected resource appears at the right moment. In each case, the experience is not created solely through effort, but through timing and openness. Receiving is often misunderstood because it is associated with dependence. But true receiving is not dependence, it is alignment. It is the ability to meet what is already present without unnecessary resistance or dismissal. There is also an internal barrier that often interferes with receiving, the belief that everything must be justified through struggle. When this belief is strong, ease can feel suspicious, support can feel undeserved, unexpected help can feel like coincidence rather than contribution, and as a result, what could have been integrated into experience is mentally minimized or discarded. Becoming a receiver involves gently questioning that reflex. It asks, what if not everything has to be earned through strain in order to be valid? What if some forms of support are simply part of how life unfolds, independent of constant effort? This does not remove effort, it repositions it. Effort becomes one part of engagement, not the entire mechanism through which life is allowed to improve. As this shift develops, perception begins to change. Life starts to feel less like a closed system, where everything must be pushed into existence, and more like a dynamic field where opportunities, timing, and support can arise from multiple directions. This is where spiritual pennies from heaven can be understood in practice, not as rare miracles, but as small instances of alignment that are only noticeable when a person is available to see them. A moment of unexpected ease, a timely insight, a brief experience of clarity that shifts direction. These are not rewards for effort alone. They are often recognized through openness. Becoming a receiver also requires trust, not blind trust, but experiential trust built through observation. Over time, a person begins to notice that not everything depends on constant control. Some things unfold without being forced. Some solutions arrive without being manufactured. Some support appears without being anticipated. And each time this is noticed, the internal narrative about what is possible begins to widen. Receiving, then, is not about waiting for life to provide everything. It is about no longer blocking what life is already offering in quieter forms. It is a shift from constant striving into balanced awareness where action and openness exist together. And in that balance, life begins to feel less like something that must be chased, and more like something that is already in motion, inviting participation at every step. Chapter 10, Living in Constant Provision Awareness. There is a difference between believing something intellectually and living from the awareness of it. Many people can agree that life provides support in various ways, that timing often aligns in unexpected moments, or that small forms of assistance appear throughout daily experience. But living in constant provision, awareness is something deeper than agreement. It is a sustained way of perceiving reality as it unfolds. Provision awareness does not mean expecting life to eliminate difficulty or guarantee comfort at every step. It does not require ignoring challenge or pretending that uncertainty does not exist. Instead, it is the practice of recognizing that within uncertainty, support is still present, sometimes visibly, sometimes quietly, and sometimes only understood in hindsight. This awareness is built gradually. It is not a sudden shift in perception, but a slow reorientation of attention. At first, it may only be noticeable in small moments, a problem resolving slightly easier than expected, a timing that works out without force, a conversation that provides unexpected clarity. These moments, when noticed, begin to form a pattern not of perfection, but of presence. Provision awareness is the recognition that life is not experienced in a vacuum of absence. Even in difficult seasons, there are layers of stability operating alongside instability. Some are practical resources, relationships, timing. Others are internal resilience, insight, endurance, adaptability. And others are subtle moments of ease, brief relief, or unexpected alignment that soften the edges of struggle. When attention is trained only on what is missing, These forms of provision can be overlooked entirely, not because they are not there, but because they do not match the intensity of the problem being focused on. Awareness tends to magnify what it repeatedly observes. This is why provision awareness is not about adding something new to reality, but about widening perception of what is already present. It does not remove responsibility. Life still requires decisions, effort, and engagement, but it changes the emotional foundation from which those actions are taken. Instead of acting from a sense of complete lack or urgency, actions begin to emerge from a more grounded recognition that support is not entirely absent from the system. This shift has a quiet but significant effect on how challenges are experienced. Problems still exist, but they are no longer interpreted as evidence of total abandonment or isolation. Instead, they become situations within a broader field of ongoing support and adjustment. This is where earlier ideas in this series come together: small signs, synchronicity, overflow thinking, and becoming a receiver. They all point toward a single shift in perception, the ability to notice that life is not only defined by what is missing, but also by what continuously sustains, adjusts, and responds in subtle ways. Spiritual pennies from heaven can be understood here not as rare exceptions, but as reminders, small, often overlooked, confirmations that life contains more responsiveness than fear tends to assume, a moment that works out unexpectedly, a need met in an indirect way, a sense of timing that feels strangely appropriate. These experiences do not eliminate hardship, but they challenge the assumption that hardship is the only active force present. They introduce balance into interpretation. Living in constant provision awareness is not about certainty. It is about relationship, a relationship with experience that includes both effort and openness, both challenge and support, both uncertainty and occasional alignment. Over time, this way of living changes how the world is inhabited. Less energy is spent assuming absence. More energy becomes available for engagement with what is actually present. Decisions feel less like survival responses and more like conscious participation. And perhaps most importantly, life begins to feel less like something that must constantly be defended against, and more like something that is continuously unfolding with moments of support woven quietly throughout it. Not always dramatic, not always obvious, but present enough to be noticed when awareness is willing to see it. And in that noticing, a different experience of life becomes possible, one where provision is not a rare event, but a continuous undercurrent. Conclusion: the quiet return to awareness. As this journey comes to a close, nothing external has been fundamentally changed. Life itself has not been altered by new rules or rewritten by new guarantees. The same uncertainties remain, the same responsibilities continue, the same unpredictable rhythm of experience still unfolds from one moment to the next. And yet, something internal has been invited to shift, not through force, but through attention. Across these chapters, the focus has not been on creating a different world, but on seeing this one differently, from small signs to synchronicity, from scarcity to overflow, from fear narratives to provision awareness. The thread has remained consistent. Perception shapes experience more than we often realize. Spiritual pennies from heaven, in all their symbolic meaning, were never about literal currency or external proof. They were always pointing toward a way of noticing, an invitation to recognize that meaning, timing, and support often arrive in forms that are easy to overlook if attention is narrowed only to what is large, urgent, or obvious. The mind tends to simplify life into categories: success or failure, gain or loss, presence or absence. But lived experience is rarely that clean. It is layered, overlapping, and often far more nuanced than the labels we place upon it. And within that nuance, subtle forms of support, alignment, and guidance can exist without demanding attention. To see this is not to deny difficulty, it is to widen context, because difficulty, when viewed in isolation, can feel absolute. But when seen within a broader field of experience, it becomes part of a larger movement, one that also contains moments of relief, unexpected resolution, quiet timing, and small forms of grace that do not always announce themselves loudly. This is where awareness becomes essential, not as a tool for control, and not as a way to force meaning onto every event, but as a way of staying present enough to notice what is actually unfolding before interpretation takes over completely. Awareness does not eliminate uncertainty, but it changes the relationship to uncertainty. It allows life to be experienced without immediately collapsing every moment into fear or lack. It creates space between what happens and how it is understood. In that space, something subtle becomes possible. The recognition that life is not only defined by what is missing, but also by what continues to appear in quiet, consistent, and often unexpected ways. This recognition does not require constant positivity. It does not require denying struggle or pretending that everything is always aligned. It simply requires willingness to see more than one layer at a time, and in that willingness, experience becomes less rigid, less absolute, more open. What once appeared as randomness may begin to feel slightly more connected. What once felt like absence may reveal small forms of presence. What once felt purely disconnected may begin to show faint patterns of timing and support, not as proof of perfection, but as evidence that life is more textured than it first appears. Ultimately, the invitation of this work is not to believe differently, but to notice differently, to allow attention to soften its fixation on limitation just enough to recognize that other dimensions of experience have always been present, and perhaps that is what Pennies from Heaven has always been pointing toward, not something rare, falling into life from elsewhere, but something already within life, becoming visible through awareness. Small, subtle, easily missed, yet meaningful enough to change how everything else is seen. And when that shift occurs, even quietly, the ordinary world begins to feel a little less closed, and a little more alive with possibility.